You're nothing but a squatter, Jack. A thief stealing from a dead man. My ex-wife's brother, Mark, slammed his fist onto my mahogany desk hard enough to make the framed photo of his father rattle. His face was a shade of crimson I'd rarely seen outside of a blown head gasket. Behind him stood my ex-wife, Elena, arms crossed, looking at me with a mixture of pity and ice-cold entitlement. And behind her, the rest of the clan, the doctors, the other lawyer, all staring at me like I was something they'd scraped off the bottom of their Italian leather shoes. "It's not yours," Elena hissed, her voice trembling, not with sadness, but with rage. "It's my father's legacy. You aren't family anymore. You're just the hired help who overstayed his welcome. Sign the papers, give it back, and get out." The air in my office was thick enough to choke on. Outside the glass walls, the shop was humming, the pneumatic hiss of impact wrenches, the heavy thrum of engines, the music of the business I had built. Inside, the silence stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. I looked at the pen Mark had thrown onto the desk. I looked at the papers demanding I relinquish everything I had worked for since I was 15 years old. I didn't know it at the time, but keeping my mouth shut in that precise second was going to ignite a war that would tear whatever was left of our history apart. But to understand how I ended up the villain in the eyes of the people I once called family, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the lawyers, before the betrayal, and before the silence. I was 15 when I first walked into Frank's auto repair. I was a scrawny kid with grease under my fingernails and a chip on my shoulder, looking for a summer job. I wasn't good at school. I didn't have the patience for textbooks or the focus for lectures. But put a wrench in my hand, show me a carburetor that wasn't breathing right, and the world just made sense. Frank was the owner. He was a mountain of a man, usually covered in oil stains, with a voice like gravel in a cement mixer. He didn't care about my grades. He cared that I showed up on time and didn't strip the bolts. That summer job turned into an after-school job, which turned into a full-time career the day I graduated high school. Frank became more than a boss. He was the father figure I'd always lacked. He taught me how to listen to an engine, how to diagnose a problem by vibration alone, and, more importantly, how to treat people. That's how I met Elena. She was Frank's youngest daughter. Frank had 4 kids, 2 sons, 2 daughters. They were the pride of his life, but they existed in a different universe than he did. They were the golden children, doctors, corporate lawyers, specialists. They went to Ivy League schools and wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent. They rarely came to the shop. To them, the garage was a dirty, loud place that paid for their tuition, but wasn't somewhere they actually wanted to be. Except for Elena. She'd stop by to bring Frank lunch sometimes. We started talking over the vending machine in the waiting room. She was studying to be a pediatrician back then. She was brilliant, sharp, and beautiful in an intimidating way. But she liked that I was simple. She liked that I was grounded. We fell in love hard and fast, the mechanic and the doctor-to-be. We got married 3 years later. Frank was my best man. In his toast, he said he wasn't losing a daughter. He was finally gaining the son who actually understands transmission fluid. Everyone laughed, but I saw the look on Mark's face, the lawyer brother. He didn't laugh. He just swirled his wine and stared at me. I should have taken that as a warning. Years went by. The shop was my life. As Frank got older, his health started to decline rapidly. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away and ended with a stage 4 cancer diagnosis that gave him 6 months. It was a brutal time. The Golden children were busy with their practices and their firms. They visited the hospital, sure, but they weren't there for the day-to-day grit. they weren't there when Frank realized he couldn't lift a tire anymore. One rainy Tuesday, about 2 months before he passed, Frank called me into the back office. He looked small in his chair, a shadow of the giant he used to be. "Jack," he wheezed, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. "I'm retiring. Today." "Okay, Frank," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You rest. I'll handle the floor." "No," he cut me off. "I mean, I'm done, and I'm not selling the place to some chain that's going to rip people off. I'm giving it to you." I froze. "Frank, I can't take this. Your kids." "My kids?" He let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Mark hasn't touched a wrench in his life. Sarah thinks motor oil is toxic waste. They have their millions, Jack. They have their careers. They don't want this place. They'd sell it for scrap and turn it into a parking lot within a week of my funeral." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You built this place with me. You know every customer by name. You're the only one who respects the work. It's yours, legally. I had the papers drawn up yesterday." We did the transition properly. Everything was signed, notarized, and filed. When Frank told his children, they barely shrugged. At the time, the shop was doing okay, but it wasn't a gold mine. It was a dirty, blue-collar asset that they felt superior to. "Good for Jack," Mark had said dismissively at a Sunday dinner. "At least it keeps him busy." Frank died that winter. We buried him on a cold, gray morning. I cried harder than I had for my own parents. And the next day, I went to work, turned on the lights, and promised his ghost I wouldn't let him down. Over the next decade, I worked like a dog. I modernized the shop. I expanded into high-end detailing and custom modifications. I hired more guys, trained them the way Frank trained me. I turned Frank's Auto Repair into the premier automotive center in the city. Revenue tripled, then quadrupled. It became a serious, high-value business. But while the business soared, my marriage began to rot. Elena and I struggled with infertility. It was a long, painful, silent road of negative tests and dashed hopes. We couldn't conceive. It broke something in her. And instead of leaning on me, she pulled away. She buried herself in her work at the hospital. I buried myself in the shop. We became roommates who shared a bed, passing each other like ships in the night. I tried to bridge the gap. I suggested counseling. I planned vacations. She always had an excuse. Too tired, too busy, on call. Then came the night that changed everything. I had come home early from the shop, a surprise, I thought. I had picked up dinner from her favorite Italian place. I walked into the kitchen and saw her phone on the counter. It buzzed. I'm not a snooper. I trust people. But the name on the screen caught my eye. Dr. Sterling. And the message preview? "Can't wait to feel you again tonight. He doesn't suspect a thing." My world stopped. The blood drained from my face. I felt like I'd been kicked in the chest by a mule. When she walked into the room 5 minutes later, she saw my face. She saw the phone. And to her credit, she didn't try to lie. She didn't cry. She just looked relieved. "I'm in love with him, Jack," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "He's a surgeon. He understands my world. We have things in common." The implication hung in the air. You're just a mechanic. You were a phase. The divorce was a nightmare, but I had one thing on my side: location. We live in an alt-fault state. Adultery matters here. I had the texts, the timeline, and her admission. Because of the proof of infidelity, the judge was not lenient with her. I kept the house. I kept the majority of our savings. And because we had no children, there was no child support and absolutely no alimony. She walked away with her personal assets and her shame. I walked away with my life, my home, and my business. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I could finally mourn the relationship and move on. I was wrong. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the whispers started. I heard from mutual friends that Alina was painting herself as the victim, that I had stolen her inheritance, that I had manipulated a dying old man to cut his own children out of the family business. It was ridiculous. They hadn't wanted the shop when it was just a garage. But now that I had turned it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, now that Elena was living in a smaller apartment and realized she'd lost the safety net of my income, suddenly the legacy mattered. That brings us back to my office. Mark, Elena, and their siblings had barged past my receptionist, demanding a settlement. "You have no moral right to this place," Mark shouted, pacing in front of my desk. "Dad built this for his family. You are not family. You are an ex-husband who got lucky." I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking. I looked at Elena. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the floor, looking for a victory she hadn't earned. "I didn't get lucky, Mark," I said, my voice low and steady. "I got to work. Where were you when Frank was doing chemotherapy? You were in the Hamptons. Where were you when the roof leaked in '09 and we almost went under? You were buying a boat." "That's irrelevant," Mark snapped. "The intent was for the family to prosper. You took advantage of him when he was vulnerable. I took over a burden you were too arrogant to carry," I countered, standing up. "I'm not a small guy. Years of lifting engine blocks keeps you broad." Mark took a half step back. "Frank offered this place to all of you first," I said, looking at each of them. "He told me. He asked if you wanted it. You laughed at him. You called it a grease pit. Do you remember that, Sarah? You called your father's life work a grease pit?" Sarah, the eldest sister, flinched. "But now," I continued, my voice rising just a fraction, "now that it clears 7 figures a year, now that Elena blew up her marriage and needs a payout, now it's a sacred legacy? It's our name on the sign," Elena screamed, finally looking at me. "It's Frank's Auto Repair." "It's a name," I said cold. "But the sweat on these floors, that's mine. The relationships with the vendors, mine. The reputation, mine. Frank gave it to me because he knew I was the only one who loved it enough to keep it alive. He knew you vultures would pick the bones clean and sell the land to a developer." Mark straightened his tie, trying to regain his lawyerly composure. "We can tie you up in court for years, Jack. We can bleed you dry with legal fees. We'll sue for undue influence. We'll claim mental incapacity on Dad's part. We will ruin you unless you sign over 51%. Today." It was a threat, a nasty one. They had the money and the connections to make my life hell, even if they didn't win. They were betting on me breaking. They were betting on the blue-collar guy folding in the face of the educated elite. I looked at the photo of Frank on my desk. I remembered his laugh. I remembered his oil on his hands. I remembered him telling me, "They have their degrees, Jack. You have the touch." If I gave in, if I gave them even 1%, I would be disrespecting the only father I ever really had. I would be letting them dismantle his dream just to fund their lifestyles. I reached into my drawer. Mark smirked, thinking I was reaching for a pen to sign his settlement papers. Instead, I pulled out a framed document. It was a copy of the transfer of ownership, with a handwritten note from Frank at the bottom. "To Jack, the son I chose. Keep it running." I slammed it down on the desk, right next to Mark's fist. "Get out," I said. "Excuse me," Mark sputtered. "I said get out of my office, of my shop. If you're not off my property in 2 minutes, I'm calling the cops and having you trespassed. You want to sue me? Go ahead. I've got the best lawyers my money can buy. And I'll drag Frank's medical records into court, and I'll drag every single time you ignored him into the public record. I will make sure the whole city knows exactly how much you cared about your father when he was actually alive. The silence that followed was heavy. The air conditioning hummed. Elena looked at Mark. Mark looked at the document. He knew he was bluffing about the mental incapacity. He knew the timeline was solid. He was just trying to bully me. "You're a selfish bastard," Elena whispered, tears finally spilling over. Real tears or manipulative ones? I couldn't tell anymore. "You have everything and you won't share." "I have what I built," I said. "You made your choices, Elena. You chose Dr. Sterling. You chose to leave. You don't get to burn the house down and then complain about the ashes." Mark grabbed his papers. "This isn't over. I replied 10 years ago. You just didn't notice." They stormed out. I watched through the glass as they marched through the workshop. My mechanics stopped working to watch them go. The guys knew the story. They knew who signed their paychecks. They looked at the suits with disdain, then looked back at me. I gave them a nod. The impact wrenches started up again. That was 3 days ago. My phone has been blowing up with messages from their extended family, cousins, aunts I haven't seen in years, telling me I'm heartless. They say that business belongs to the bloodline. They say I'm punishing Elena for the affair by holding on to the family wealth. They're trying to use guilt as a weapon. And I'll admit, late at night, when the shop is empty and the lights are off, I wonder if I'm being too hard. I wonder if Frank would have wanted peace between us, even if it meant sacrificing the business. I reached into my drawer. Mark smirked, thinking I was reaching for a pen to sign his settlement papers. Instead, I pulled out a framed document. It was a copy of the transfer of ownership, with a handwritten note from Frank at the bottom. "To Jack, the son I chose. Keep it running." I slammed it down on the desk, right next to Mark's fist. "Get out," I said. "Excuse me?" Mark sputtered. I said, "Get out. Of my office, of my shop. If you're not off my property in 2 minutes, I'm calling the cops and having you trespassed. You want to sue me? Go ahead. I've got the best lawyers my money can buy. And I'll drag Frank's medical records into court, and I'll drag every single time you ignored him into the public record. I will make sure the whole city knows exactly how much you cared about your father when he was actually alive." The silence that followed was heavy. The air conditioning hummed. Elena looked at Mark. Mark looked at the document. He knew he was bluffing about the mental incapacity. He knew the timeline was solid. He was just trying to bully me. "You're a selfish bastard," Elena whispered, tears finally spilling over. Real tears or manipulative ones? I couldn't tell anymore. "You have what I built," I said. "You made your choices, Elena. You chose Dr. Sterling. You chose to leave. You don't get to burn the house down and then complain about the ashes." Mark grabbed his papers. "This isn't over. It was over 10 years ago," I replied. "You just didn't notice." They stormed out. I watched through the glass as they marched through the workshop. My mechanics stopped working to watch them go. The guys knew the story. They knew who signed their paychecks. They looked at the suits with disdain, then looked back at me. I gave them a nod. The impact wrenches started up again. That was 3 days ago. My phone has been blowing up with messages from their extended family, cousins, aunts I haven't seen in years, telling me I'm heartless. They say that business belongs to the bloodline. They say I'm punishing Elena for the affair by holding on to the family wealth. They're trying to use guilt as a weapon. And I'll admit, late at night, when the shop is empty and the lights are off, I wonder if I'm being too hard. I wonder if Frank would have wanted peace between us, even if it meant sacrificing the business. But then I look around at the lifts, the tools, the clean floors. I realize that keeping this place safe is the legacy. Giving it to people who despise the work but crave the profit would be the ultimate betrayal of the man who saved me. I'm keeping the shop, I'm keeping the house, and I'm keeping my dignity. But I have to ask, because the messages are getting to me. Am I the asshole for refusing to return a business to a family that didn't want it until it became a gold mine? Do you think I went too far by cutting them off completely? Let me know in the comments below. I really need to hear a sanity check on this one.